He paid 7 cents for a boarded-up opera house. A widow was living in the costume trunk. The gavel came down, and I didn't even have my hand up. That's the truth of it. I was standing in the back of Dunmore's Dry Goods, leaning on a post, listening to Chet Pryor auction off the leftover estate of a man named Elias Beaumont, who had died in March with no kin and no will and a considerable amount of unpaid debt to the town of Cryer's Flat, Wyoming. I was there because I had nowhere else to be on a Tuesday. I had just sold the last of my winter hay, had the cash money in my breast pocket, and was waiting on Yates to finish filling my supply order so I could load the wagon and be home before dark. Pryor called out the opera house, said it like an apology. Said the Beaumont Opera House, Lot 17, which is a boarded structure on the east end of Calhoun Street, approximately 40 by 60 feet, no fixtures, no seating, roof in unknown condition, sold as is. Opening bid, he said, is $1. Nobody moved. Pryor dropped it to 50 cents. Still nothing. Somebody in front of me coughed. Pryor looked pained. He called 25 cents and a man named Hollis Falk laughed out loud, and that laugh bounced off the tin ceiling and nobody bid, and I don't know why I did what I did next, except that the laugh irritated me in a way I still can't fully explain. I said 7 cents. Not as a joke, just it was what I had in my coat pocket, loose change from breakfast. I pulled it out and held it up, and Pryor looked at me like I had grown a second head. And then he looked around the room for somebody to counter 7 cents, and nobody did, and down came the gavel. That is how I came to own an opera house. I didn't go look at it right away. I loaded the wagon, drove home, turned the horses out, ate supper, and slept. I had 40 acres to manage alone since my brother Dix left for Colorado 2 years prior, and I didn't have time to go inspect a building I had bought by accident for less than a cup of coffee. I put the deed in the tin box under my bunk with my other papers and tried to forget about it. Lasted about 9 days. It was the not knowing. I kept thinking about the roof. Unknown condition, Pryor had said. I've never been a man who does well with unknown conditions. So on the 10th day, I hitched the buckboard and drove into Cryer's Flat and turned east on Calhoun and pulled up in front of Lot 17 and sat there looking at it for a minute. It was bad. The boards over the windows were warped and splitting. The marquee above the door still had Beaumont's Grand Opera House painted on it in letters that had once been gold, now the color of old teeth. The door itself was chained with a padlock that looked newer than anything else on the building, which struck me as odd. Most of the paint had peeled or blistered away. A section of the decorative cornice along the top had fallen and lay in pieces on the boardwalk. I sat there in the wagon and thought, I paid 7 cents for this. And somehow I felt it was still possible I had overpaid. I climbed down, found the key Pryor had handed me with the deed, and walked to the door. The padlock was newer, but the key fitted, and the chain came loose, and I pushed the door open against a pile of something on the floor and stepped inside. It was dark, smelled like old wood and dust and something else. Faintly, something that wasn't rot and wasn't mildew but was more like a kitchen, like something cooked. I stood still waiting for my eyes to find what light there was, which came from gaps in the boards on the windows and from a long crack in the roof at the far end where pale sky showed through. The stage was still there, a wood floor broad, dusty. The curtain long gone, but the rigging still hung, ropes draped down like dead snakes. Scattered across the floor were the ghosts of Elias Beaumont's ambition, a toppled music stand, a velvet chair with all its stuffing gone, a cracked mirror in a gilt frame standing against the far wall. And near the back, against the stage left wall, a large trunk, painted black, brass hardware, the kind theater companies haul costumes in. I noticed it because there was a tin cup sitting on top of it, and the tin cup had steam coming off it. I stood very still. There was a sound then from behind me, not from the trunk, from a side passage I hadn't yet looked down. A door carefully opened. the sound of someone trying to be quiet who wasn't quite managing it. I turned around slow. She was standing in the passage with a cast iron skillet in her right hand held up at shoulder height, and she was looking at me the way a person looks when they've been caught and have decided that offense is the only defense left to them. She was maybe 35, dark hair worn back hard, a gray dress that had been washed so many times the color had gone out of it. Good boots, though, I noticed that. Good leather, resoled recently, and her eyes were dark and level and she was not trembling. She said, "This is my home." Said it flat, not a question, not a plea, a declaration. I said it was. As of 11 days ago, it's mine. She didn't lower the skillet. I didn't move. We looked at each other across that empty floor in the thin light coming through the cracked boards, and I was aware of the steam still rising from the tin cup on the trunk, and I thought, she's been here a while. This isn't a woman who crept in last night. This is a woman who has been living in this building long enough to have a kitchen routine. I said, "You want to put that down, or you want to keep holding it up like that?" She said, "Depends on what you're planning." I said, "Right now I'm planning to find out how bad the roof is." That seemed to confuse her. The skillet came down maybe 6 inches. She said, "You're not here to put me out." I said, "I don't know yet what I'm here to do. I just bought this thing 10 days ago and I came to look at the roof." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The roof is bad on the east end. The west side holds. I've been keeping a bucket there when it rains." I looked up at the crack of sky I'd seen when I came in. East end, like she said. I said, "How long have you been here?" She said, "Since November." It was March. She had been living in an abandoned opera house through a Wyoming winter. I thought about the padlock that was newer than everything else. I thought about the tin cup of something hot on top of a costume trunk. I said, "What's in the trunk?" She hesitated. Then she said, "My daughter." Not hidden, sleeping. A girl of maybe 4, I found out, curled inside the trunk on a folded horse blanket with another blanket pulled over her. The trunk had holes drilled in the back panel. I saw them later for air. She drilled them herself with a hand bit she'd found in the building's back room. The woman's name was Cora Neal. Her husband Aldous had died the previous summer of a burst appendix, 3 days after the pain started, before anyone could get a doctor from Tanner's Ridge. He'd left her the use of a rented room above the feed store, which lasted until the feed store owner's cousin arrived from Missouri needing the room, and she was out with 70 cents and a 4-year-old, and most of a Wyoming winter still ahead. She'd found the opera house because the padlock on the chain hadn't been secured properly. Beaumont had just looped it, not latched it, and the door pushed open from the inside of the loop, and she'd gone in for a night out of the wind and then just never left. She'd re-looped the chain from inside each night. She'd found a small iron stove in the back passage, vented to the outside. Beaumont must have used it for himself, and she'd kept it running on scavenged wood and a little coal she bought when she had money, which was sometimes. She told me all this standing in the middle of that empty stage floor with the skillet held down now at her side, telling it plain, not asking for anything, just explaining how it was. The way you tell somebody the facts so they can't pretend later they didn't know them. I listened. When she was done, I said, "The girl, what's her name?" She said, "Fern." I said, "All right, I'm going to go look at the roof. I'll use the side door so I don't wake her." And I did. I went out and found a ladder in the back alley and got up and walked the roof for 20 minutes. East end was bad, 3 sections soft underfoot, and one place I went through almost to my knee. West side was solid, like she'd said. The whole structure was sound enough, bones good, just the skin of it ruined from years of Beaumont not spending money on maintenance. I came back in and found Cora Neal sitting on the edge of the stage with a tin plate on her knee eating something from a small pot. She'd put a second tin plate beside her. She didn't look up. She said, "I didn't know if you'd eaten." I sat down and ate. It was beans and salt pork, and it was good. We sat on the stage of an opera house in Cryer's Flat, Wyoming, in the thin March light, eating beans off tin plates and not talking. After a while I said, "East End needs new sheeting and shingles on 3 sections, maybe 4. I can do 2 of them myself. Third one, I'll need a man up there with me." She said, "Why are you telling me this?" I said, "Because you're living here. Seems like you'd want to know." She looked at me then, just looked for a moment. Then she looked back at the empty floor. She said, "You're not going to put us out." I said, "I haven't decided what I'm doing with this building. When I do, you'll know. Until then, you're not sleeping in the cold." That was all I said about it. I took the plate back to the little iron stove, rinsed it in the basin she had set up back there, and left. I came back 3 days later with lumber. Not for the roof yet, roof would take planning and supplies. But there was a section of interior wall near where they slept, the east side near the back, that had a gap in it where a window frame had warped out and the wind came straight through. I'd thought about that gap for 3 days. I thought about a 4-year-old in a trunk on a horse blanket and a Wyoming night in March. Cora Neal was not there when I arrived, but Fern was awake, sitting on the lid of the trunk eating a piece of bread and watching me with her mother's dark eyes. She didn't seem frightened, just watchful. I said, "Your mother know you're here alone?" She said, "I'm not alone, Chester's here." Chester turned out to be a gray cat of uncertain vintage, who emerged from behind the stove and sat down, and looked at me with similar suspicion to the girl. I said, "Fair enough." I fixed the wall. Cora came back an hour later with a basket of mending. She'd found work taking in sewing from 2 of the women on the merchant row. She stopped when she saw what I was doing and watched me for a while and didn't say anything. When I was done, she said it looked solid. I said it was. She said, "Thank you." I said, "The roofing will take a week of good weather. I'll start it when we get a stretch." I came back 6 more times in March, then every few days in April. I patched what could be patched. I found the problem with the stove's flue pipe, which was drawing wrong and filling the back rooms with trace smoke. Nothing dangerous yet, but it would have been, eventually. I fixed it. I got up in the east end of the roof with a man named Spurlock who owed me a half-day's labor, and we put down new sheeting and shingles on 3 bad sections. Cost me $40 in materials and a day and a half, and when the rain came in April, the building stayed dry. I didn't think about whether I should be doing it. That's the thing about a practical problem, it calls to me. The problem was there, the fix was within my ability, so I did it. That's all it was. That's what I told myself. But I was thinking about that gap in the wall. I thought about it more than I thought about my own fence line, which needed work. Cora Neal worked. She was not a woman sitting in that building waiting to be taken care of. She had the sewing work, and she had added to it by April a morning arrangement with the hotel on Main Street, helping their cook with breakfast service 3 days a week. Fern came with her on those mornings, apparently sitting in the hotel kitchen eating biscuits and charming the cook, whose name was Mrs. Aldridge, who had no grandchildren and a powerful need to spoil someone. I learned these things because Cora told them to me. Not in long conversations. We were not long conversation people, either of us. But she'd tell me things in plain declarative sentences while I was working, the way you'd brief someone on the status of a job site. The hotel work pays 50 cents a session. Mrs. Aldridge gave Fern a pair of boots. I've taken on mending for Harlan's wife, which is likely to be permanent because the woman cannot sew a straight seam to save her life. She made me laugh, that last one. The way she said it, not intending to be funny. I think she was surprised when I laughed. She looked at me for a second and then away. I was there the afternoon Holly's Falk came to the door. Falk was the man who had laughed at the auction. He was a merchant of the general type who always has 2 or 3 irons in the fire and likes people to know it. He owned a share in the grain warehouse and a piece of the livery, and had been, I'd heard, A friend of Beaumont's in the way that men who lend money are friends with men who need it. He knocked on the door. The chain was off in the daytime now. The door stood open when the weather was fair, and came in and looked around and then looked at Cora Neal like she was inventory. He said he was glad to see someone was keeping the place up. Said he'd heard the new owner had been making improvements and had come to discuss a proposition. He barely glanced at me. I was up on a ladder at the time, rehanging a broken section of the curtain rigging that was rusted and dangerous. He spoke to Cora like she was the owner. She said, "Mr. Casto is the owner." She said it with her eyes on him, no expression. Falk looked over at me then. He revised whatever opinion he'd formed and began again. He said that he'd been thinking the building could do service as a second warehouse for the grain operation. Dry storage. He said he'd be prepared to offer me $150 for the structure as is, which he felt was generous given the condition. I came down off the ladder. I said, $150. He said yes. He said he knew it wasn't much, but the building was a liability really, the roof, the condition of the interior. I said, the roof's fixed. I put $400 of work into this structure in the last 2 months. That wasn't exactly true. It was closer to 60 in materials and my own labor. But I said 400 and watched his face adjust. He said, well, of course, if there have been improvements, perhaps the number could be reconsidered. I said it's not for sale. He looked at Cora again, like she might overturn this. She was watching him with those level dark eyes and didn't say anything. He left. Cora said, "You didn't have to do that." I said, "I know." She said, "You're not going to do anything with a 40 by 60 opera house on the east end of Calhoun Street in Cryer's Flat." I said I might. She said, "What?" I said, "I haven't decided yet." I had decided. I just hadn't said it out loud yet because saying it out loud would make it a thing that could be questioned or laughed at, and I wasn't ready for that. But the truth was that I had been thinking since about the 3rd week of repairs about what Cryer's Flat was and what it lacked, and what a structure like this could be if somebody put money and sense into it. The nearest proper social hall was 40 miles east in Dundee. People here had dances in a barn on the Pryor property, which was generous of the Pryors but not quite the same as a floor built for it, and a stage built for music, and 4 walls that didn't leak. A town of 800 people ought to have a hall. I didn't tell Cora this right then. I thought about it for another 2 weeks, and then one evening when we were sitting at the small table she'd set up near the stove eating supper. This had become a habit somewhere in April. I would stay, and she would cook if I was there in the evening, and we would eat and not talk much, and it was the best part of most of my days, and I had mostly stopped pretending otherwise. I told her. I said, I'm going to fix the whole building. Stage, floor, the curtain rigging. Get a piano. Open it as a social hall, charge rental for events, maybe book acts when they pass through. This town needs a proper hall and nobody's going to build one, so it might as well be this one. She was quiet for a moment. She said, that's a real plan. I said, it's a plan. She said, you'll need someone to manage it. Schedule the events, collect the fees, keep the accounts. I said, I know that. She said, I can do that. Not asking, offering. She said it the same way she told me about the roof as a fact, a piece of relevant information. I can do that. Like it was obvious, like the conversation had been heading here for 2 months and we were just arriving. I said, I know you can. We looked at each other across that little table by the stove. She said, you'd pay me a wage. I said, fair one. She said, then yes. She put out her hand and I shook it, and that was the agreement, and neither one of us said anything more about it that night. But I noticed she was sitting a little straighter. The work took the rest of the spring and into summer. I spent $40 on the floor, had to replace about 1/3 of the stage boards and refinish the rest. The curtain rigging I mostly rebuilt myself over 4 long evenings. I found a piano in Dundee at an estate sale, bought it for $12 and hauled it back in the wagon in pieces, tuned it myself badly, and then paid the schoolteacher $3 to do it right. I put in 2 new windows on the west side to get some light into the place. I built a proper ticket booth by the front door. Cora ran the interior. She organized the back rooms into a coat room and a small office. She made curtains from fabric she bought wholesale in Dundee. Took her 3 weeks, every evening, and they were good, done right, the kind of curtains that hang true. She made a sign for the door. She painted the names of the seating sections on the wall in careful letters. Fern had opinions about the curtains. She was a child with opinions about everything by summer. She had a jurisdiction now, a specific corner of the backstage area, near the old stove, which was hers, where she kept a collection of small objects that she rotated regularly and which apparently had a complex internal significance. Chester, the cat, presided over this territory with great dignity. In June we put on the first event, dance, 50 cents a couple. I played no instrument and danced poorly, but I stood at the door and took the money, and Cora sat at the ticket table in a blue dress I had not seen before, and every person who came through that door was greeted by name if she knew it, and with a handshake and a welcome if she didn't. By 9 o'clock there were 90 people in that building, and the piano player was working hard, and the floor was full, and I stood in the back and watched it. Holly's Falk came. Of course he came. He came with his wife, and he nodded to me at the door in a way that acknowledged something he wasn't going to say out loud. He paid his $1 and went in. July we had a traveling fiddle trio book a Thursday night. August brought a church social from the congregation out on the Biggs Road who needed a space larger than their building. September, another dance. October, a debate organized by the schoolteacher which I did not fully understand but which filled the place up. The building paid for itself before winter. The night of the October debate I stayed late after everyone left, putting the chairs back. Cora stayed too. Fern was asleep in her corner. She slept anywhere, that child, with the complete confidence of someone who had never once worried about whether she had a place to be. Cora was at the ticket table doing the accounts, the lamp pulled close, her hand moving across the ledger in the precise small script she used for numbers. I was stacking chairs, and I stopped and looked at her for a minute in that lamplight. She looked up. She said, "What?" I said, "Nothing." She said, "Cal." I said, "What?" She said, "You've been staring at me for 10 minutes. I said, "I have not." She said, "You've been stacking the same 3 chairs. I looked down. She was right. I'd moved the same 3 chairs 4 times. I said, "I've been thinking." She said, "About what?" I said, "About whether this is." And then I didn't finish it because I wasn't sure how to finish it without sounding like a fool. She set down her pen. She stood up from the table. She walked across the floor to where I was standing with my 3 chairs, and she stopped about 2 feet from me, and she said, "I know what you've been thinking about." I said, "Is that right?" She said, "For about 4 months now." I said, "And?" She said, "And I'm not a woman who needs to be handled gently, Cal. I'm a woman who needs to know where she stands." I said, "Right here. You stand right here if you want to." She looked at me for a long time, not uncertain, just taking it in the way she did everything fully before she responded. Then she stepped forward and put her hand flat on my chest, just below my collar, and she left it there. Not a dramatic thing, just a hand on a man's chest feeling his heart. She said, "That's where I want to stand." I put my hand over hers. That's all. The lamp burning, the chairs half stacked, Fern asleep in her corner with Chester the cat curled against her back, and Cora Neal's hand against my chest and mine over it. We stayed like that for a while. I have thought about a lot of things in my life. Thought about the ranch, the cattle, the weather, money, what would happen when I got old and there was nobody to take over the work. Thought about my brother gone to Colorado. thought about a lot of things that worried me and a few that didn't. I don't think about those things the same way now. What I think about now mostly is this. A man can spend a long time building towards something without knowing what it is. Doing the next practical thing, fixing what's broken, showing up where he's needed. Not because he's noble, I'm not a noble man, I want to be clear about that, but because a problem in front of him calls to him and he answers it. That's just how he's built. Sometimes, if he's lucky, the thing he's been building toward has dark eyes and a level gaze, and a hand that she puts on your chest like she knows exactly what she's doing. That opera house held its first New Year's dance in December. 200 people by my count. We had to turn folk away. Cora had organized it down to the quarter hour. I stood at the door the whole night collecting tickets and greeting people and watching them go into something warm and lit and alive. And when the clock turned midnight, she came and found me at the door and stood next to me. Not in front of me, not behind me, but right next to me, her shoulder against my arm, and we listened to the fiddle going inside. She didn't say anything, neither did I. That's enough, that's more than enough. A man stands at the door of something he built, with a good woman at his side who chose to be there, and the town coming in out of the cold to something he made for them, and the fiddle playing. That's all a man really needs to know about himself.